The day Billionaire, Betty collapsed at her own dining table, clutching her chest and gasping for air. Her family didn't call an ambulance first. They called the lawyer. 3 weeks later, she was declared dead. Her funeral was magnificent. Tears flowed like rivers, and her siblings delivered eulogies that would make angels weep. But Betty wasn't in that coffin. She was 3,000 miles away, watching everything through hidden cameras, and what she saw would make her wish she had actually died, because the truth waiting for her was worse than any grave. Betty wasn't born into wealth. She was born into struggle, into a small house with too many mouths to feed and not enough food to go around. Her father died when she was 12, leaving behind debts that would take years to repay. Her mother worked 3 jobs, and Betty, the eldest of 4 children, became a second mother to her younger siblings. She cooked for them, walked them to school, and lied about why there was no dinner some nights. She told them she wasn't hungry, that she'd already eaten. But the truth was simpler and sadder. There just wasn't enough. Betty learned early that being the eldest meant carrying burdens no child should carry, meant sacrificing in silence, meant becoming invisible so others could shine. At 16, she got a scholarship to university, but when she told her family, her uncle said the money should go toward fixing the roof. Her aunt suggested she work instead and send money home. Betty realized something that would shape the rest of her life. Her dreams were never fully hers. They belonged to everyone who needed something from her. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. And comment your location below. I want to know where my amazing viewers are watching from. I read every comment and I will be giving shout out in my next video. Shout out to Patrinus from Portsmouth and Nana G Music from Grenada and Elizabeth Golden from Canada. Now back to the story. But she went anyway. She worked 2 jobs, studied through the night, graduated top of her class, and started a business with money she saved by skipping meals. 10 years later, she was a millionaire. 20 years later, a billionaire. And through it all, her family was there, hands outstretched, needs endless, gratitude fleeting. Betty married once, a good man named Daniel, who saw her as a partner. They built the empire together. For 10 years, they were happy. Then he died suddenly at 42, and Betty was alone with twin daughters, Eunice and Esther, who were only 5 years old. She poured everything into those girls. Every decision she made was for them. She wanted them to have what she never had: security, options, a childhood where they didn't have to sacrifice for anyone. And she succeeded. Eunice and Esther grew up in a mansion with gardens like paradise, attended the best schools, and never wondered if there would be food on the table. But Betty's siblings never stopped needing, and Betty never stopped giving. Her brother Thomas tried business after business and failed every time, leaving behind debts and broken promises. Betty paid them all. She funded his new ventures, covered his rent, even hired him in her company. But Thomas never showed up on time, never finished projects. When Betty confronted him, he said she was too controlling, that maybe if she trusted him more, he'd perform better. And Betty, exhausted from running an empire and raising twins alone, let it go. She always let it go. Then came her sister Grace, obsessed with status and looking wealthy even when she wasn't. She threw parties she couldn't afford, bought designer clothes on credit, and when the bills came due, she came to Betty. Betty paid for Grace's lifestyle, her children's private school fees, her luxury vacations. When Betty suggested Grace should budget, Grace cried and said Betty didn't understand what it was like to be the poor sister of a billionaire. She made Betty feel guilty for having more, as if success were a crime and sharing wealth was penance. The youngest sibling, Mark, was a gambler who owed money to dangerous people. When they came looking for him, he sent them to Betty. She paid his debts more times than she could count, each time extracting a promise that he'd stop. But it never was the last time. If you've ever been the person everyone comes to when they need something, but no one checks on when you're falling apart, if you've ever felt like your kindness was being mistaken for weakness, hit the like button right now. Because Betty's story is about to take a turn that will make you question everything you thought you knew about family. Betty was 52 when the world started closing in on her. It began with exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix, the kind that made her bones ache and her thoughts scatter. She ignored it. She had a board meeting to prepare for, a merger to finalize, a charity gala speech to give. But the body keeps score, and eventually it demands payment. She was presenting quarterly reports when the room started spinning. Her chest tightened, her vision blurred, and she hit the floor. She woke up in a hospital room with Eunice and Esther holding her hands so tightly it hurt. The doctor came in with the kind of face that tells you everything before words do. Breast cancer, stage 2, aggressive but treatable, surgery, chemotherapy, radiation. Betty nodded, asked practical questions, thanked the doctor, and waited until he left before allowing herself to feel anything. What she felt wasn't fear of dying. It was terror of what would happen to her daughters if she did. Because she knew, with a certainty that made her sick, that her family couldn't be trusted with Eunice and Esther. The family came to visit, of course. They brought flowers and sympathetic faces. But Betty noticed things. She noticed how Thomas asked about her will within the first 10 minutes. She noticed how Grace's eyes roamed the hospital room, already mentally dividing assets. She noticed how Mark didn't ask about treatment options, but about whether she'd updated her insurance beneficiaries. They weren't visiting a sick sister. They were visiting an estate they wanted to inherit. And when they thought she was asleep, she heard them talking in the hallway about the mansion, the company, the investments, talking about how much everything was worth and who deserved what. Talking about the twins like they were inconvenient details to be managed, not children to be loved. That was when Betty knew she couldn't die. Not yet. Not until she understood exactly who these people were and what they would do to her daughters once she was gone. The answer came to her one sleepless night, an idea so strange and desperate that only someone with nothing to lose would consider it. She would fake her death. She would disappear, let the world believe she was gone, and watch what happened when her family thought no one was watching them anymore. It was extreme, maybe even cruel, but Betty had learned that sometimes the only way to see the truth is to remove yourself from the equation entirely. She shared the plan with only one person, her assistant Maria, who had been with her for 20 years. Maria was horrified at first, tried to talk her out of it, but Betty explained that she needed proof. She needed to see the worst so she would know how to protect against it. And Maria, who had watched Betty sacrifice herself for people who never sacrificed anything in return, finally agreed. The fake death required precision. Betty arranged to go abroad for treatment, telling her family she needed specialized care available only in Europe. She left Eunice and Esther with Maria temporarily, telling them it was just for a few weeks. She hated lying to her daughters, hated the fear in their eyes when she said goodbye, but she told herself it was necessary. Once abroad, she worked with doctors who created false medical records showing rapid decline, organ failure, death. The death certificate was filed. Maria handled the logistics back home, notifying the family, arranging the funeral, playing the role of the devastated assistant while secretly installing cameras throughout the mansion. Cameras in the living room, the kitchen, the hallways, even hidden cameras in the twins' rooms. Betty watched it all from a small apartment in Switzerland where she was actually receiving treatment. She watched her own funeral through a screen, saw her siblings cry beautifully for the cameras, heard them deliver speeches about what a wonderful sister she'd been. She watched Eunice and Esther, pale and silent, standing like ghosts among the mourners. And she waited for the masks to fall. The change happened faster than she expected. The day after the funeral, Thomas called a family meeting. He suggested the girls move out of the master wing because it was too big for children. Grace agreed immediately, already planning renovations. Mark suggested they cut the household staff to save money, fire the maids and the cook because the twins didn't need all that luxury. And Eunice and Esther sat there, 11 years old and freshly orphaned, listening to adults dismantle their home while their mother's body was supposedly barely cold. If watching this makes your blood boil, if you believe children should be protected even when no one's watching, hit the like button right now and let me know I'm not alone in feeling this rage. Betty watched through the cameras, hands shaking, heart pounding, feeling something die inside her that had nothing to do with cancer. Because she'd hoped, despite everything, that she was wrong. She'd hoped that her death would bring out something better in them, that grief would soften their edges, that love for the twins would override greed. But what she saw in the days and weeks that followed was worse than anything she could have imagined. Grace moved into the master bedroom the very next day, went through Betty's closets like a scavenger, taking jewelry and designer clothes. When Eunice asked if she could keep their mother's favorite scarf, Grace said no, that it was too valuable, that children didn't understand the worth of things. She moved the twins into a smaller room at the end of the hallway, the room that used to be storage, and told them they should be grateful to have a roof over their heads at all. She fired Maria first, said the family didn't need outside help. Maria hugged Eunice and Esther goodbye, whispering something the camera couldn't catch. Then Maria left, and the twins were alone with wolves. Thomas took over Betty's company immediately, installed himself as CEO, despite having no qualifications and a history of running businesses into the ground. He fired Betty's loyal staff and replaced them with his friends. Within weeks, he'd made decisions that cost the company millions. When the board tried to intervene, he reminded them that he was family, that Betty would have wanted him in charge. He used Betty's name like a shield, weaponized her generosity even after death, and bled the company dry. Mark moved into the mansion too, said he needed to be close to the twins. But what he really needed was free room and board and access to whatever money he could siphon. He started selling Betty's art collection piece by piece, pawned her jewelry, emptied her wine cellar, even sold her car collection to cover his gambling debts. When Eunice noticed her mother's favorite painting was missing, Mark told her it had been damaged and thrown away. The lie was casual, effortless, delivered with the confidence of someone who knew an 11-year-old had no power to challenge him. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers. But I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please click the subscribe button and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. The cruelty started small. Grace stopped buying the twins new clothes, said they had to make do because money was tight. This was a lie. The estate was worth hundreds of millions. But Grace wanted the twins to feel poor, to feel like burdens. She made them eat after everyone else, gave them smaller portions, and if they complained, she reminded them that beggars can't be choosers. Thomas was worse in his own way. He ignored them so completely, it was like they'd stopped existing. When Esther tried to ask him about school paperwork, he waved her away without looking up. When Eunice needed help with something their mother used to handle, he told her to figure it out herself, that she was old enough to stop being so needy. He made them feel invisible, made them understand that in this new hierarchy, they ranked below everyone. But Mark was the one who scared them most. Mark had a temper that appeared without warning, especially when he was drunk or had just lost money gambling. He'd explode over tiny things, scream at the twins for leaving shoes in the hallway. One night, Esther accidentally knocked over a glass while setting the table. Mark grabbed her arm so hard it left bruises, dragged her to her room, and locked her inside for the entire night. Eunice pounded on the door, begging him to let Esther out, saying she was sorry, saying it was her fault. But Mark just laughed and said maybe now they'd both learn to be more careful. Betty watched this through the camera, watched her daughter being brutalized, and had to physically restrain herself from getting on a plane that instant. Maria, monitoring the feeds, called her sobbing. But Betty said no, not yet. She needed more proof, needed documentation that would hold up legally. Eunice tried to protect Esther the way their mother had protected everyone. She took the blame when things went wrong, positioned herself between Esther and Mark's anger, saved food from her own plate to sneak to her sister when Grace gave them too little dinner. She was 11 years old and already carrying the weight of the world. And Esther, sweet, gentle Esther, who used to laugh so easily, stopped speaking almost entirely. She went selective mute from trauma, communicated only in nods and whispers to Eunice when they were alone. The family didn't notice or care that they'd broken a child so thoroughly she'd lost her voice. They just said she was being dramatic, needed to toughen up. Betty watched her daughter disappear into silence and felt rage so pure it was almost clarifying. But the worst came during one of those late nights when the adults thought the twins were asleep. Thomas, Grace, and Mark had gathered for drinks. They were talking, freely, no filters. Thomas said the twins were becoming a problem, too expensive to maintain. Grace agreed, said they should look into boarding schools, the cheap kind, far away, where the girls could be someone else's problem. Mark suggested they could contest the will, claim Betty wasn't of sound mind, argue that they as adults deserved more control over the entire estate. They laughed about it, made jokes about how easy it would be, how judges always sided with adults over children. And then Grace said something that made Betty's blood run cold. She said maybe it would be better if something happened to the twins. Nothing obvious, of course, but accidents happen all the time with children. She said it casually, like she was discussing the weather, and Thomas and Mark didn't disagree. They just sat there, drinking Betty's expensive whiskey in Betty's house, discussing ways to eliminate Betty's children. And Betty realized that she hadn't faked her death to test her family. She'd faked it to save her daughter's lives. How would you feel if you discovered the people you trusted most were plotting against your children? How would you keep watching without intervening? Comment below, because I need to know I'm not alone in feeling this rage. Betty made the call to Maria that night, said it was time. Maria had been keeping detailed records, had backups of all the camera footage, had documented every instance of abuse and neglect and theft. They had enough evidence to destroy everyone legally. But Betty wanted one more thing. She wanted them to see her face when she came back. Wanted them to understand that they hadn't gotten away with anything, that every cruel word and action had been witnessed. So they planned the return carefully. A family meeting scheduled by the lawyer, supposedly to discuss the final distribution of the estate. Everyone would be there, expecting their feast, and instead they'd get Betty. The twins didn't know. Betty had insisted on that. They'd been through enough disappointment, enough loss. So Eunice and Esther were told to attend the meeting by Grace, who said the lawyer needed to see them for paperwork. The twins came downstairs that evening, dressed in clothes that were too small now because no one had bought them anything new in months. They looked thin, haunted, older than children should look. Eunice held Esther's hand tightly, and they positioned themselves in the corner like they were trying to take up as little space as possible. The family gathered, Thomas and Grace and Mark, and all their spouses and older children, everyone who'd been feeding off Betty's corpse for months. They were relaxed, confident, already discussing what they'd do with their shares. The lawyer stood at the front, looking grim. He said there had been some irregularities that needed to be addressed. Thomas frowned, his tone annoyed. The lawyer didn't answer. Instead, he pressed a button on his laptop, and the large television screen flickered to life. And there, walking into the room through the door behind him, was Betty, alive, real. The room went absolutely silent. Someone dropped a glass, and it shattered, but no one moved. They just stared, faces cycling through shock, confusion, fear, and finally, terrible understanding. Betty stood there, looking at each of them in turn, seeing the guilt written on every face. Eunice gasped, and Esther made a sound like a wounded animal. They ran to her, crashed into her arms, and Betty held them like she'd never let go again. She held them while they sobbed, felt their two thin bodies shaking, felt months of trauma pouring out in tears. She whispered apologies, told them she was here now, that they were safe, that no one would ever hurt them again. And over their heads, she looked at her siblings, and her face was absolutely cold. The lawyer began playing the footage, clip after clip of cruelty. Mark grabbing Esther and locking her in her room. Grace calling the twins burdens. Thomas discussing boarding schools and contesting the will. The casual conversations about accidents and how easy it would be to get rid of 2 children. Every moment documented, time-stamped, undeniable. Betty watched her family's faces as they realized they'd been caught, that their masks had been ripped away, that all their careful lies were exposed. Some tried to protest, started making excuses, but Betty held up one hand and the room fell silent. She spoke quietly, but her voice carried months of heartbreak. She told them she'd given them everything: money, opportunities, second chances, unconditional support. She'd paid their debts, funded their lifestyles, sacrificed her health to ensure they had what they needed. And the moment they thought she was gone, they revealed who they truly were. Not family, not even decent humans. Just opportunistic predators who saw two vulnerable children as obstacles to wealth. She told them she'd made many mistakes in her life, but the biggest was believing that her love could inspire love in return. But you can't teach people to have souls. Either they have them or they don't. Betty told them the mansion was no longer theirs. The company shares they'd been given were revoked. The accounts they'd accessed were frozen and audited. Every penny they'd stolen would be tracked and repaid. Legal proceedings were beginning, not just civil, but criminal charges for child abuse, fraud, embezzlement. She wasn't just cutting them off financially. She was dismantling every aspect of the lives they'd built on her generosity. Thomas tried to speak, started to say she didn't understand, that they were family. Betty laughed, a sound so bitter it made everyone flinch. She said they were right, they were family, and that's what made it so much worse. Because family was supposed to protect the vulnerable, not exploit them. Family was supposed to love children, not plot their elimination. Grace tried tears, the same weapon she'd used, successfully for years. She sobbed that she was sorry, that grief had made her act irrationally. But Betty just looked at her with something like pity and said that grief doesn't make you abuse children. Evil does. Mark tried anger, said Betty had no right to trick them. Betty agreed. She said it was cruel. It was manipulative. It was the only way to see the truth. And now that she'd seen it, she couldn't unsee it. She would never forgive. The lawyer distributed formal legal notices, restraining orders preventing them from contacting the twins, asset freezes pending investigation, scheduled court dates for multiple charges. The family read through the paperwork, and reality began sinking in. This wasn't a dramatic gesture. This was the end of everything. Their access to Betty's wealth was gone. Their reputations would be destroyed. Some would likely face jail time, and it was all their own fault, documented in their own words and actions. If you believe in justice, if you believe that people who hurt children should face consequences, comment justice right now. And hit the subscribe button, because stories like this need to be told. Betty took Eunice and Esther and left that night. They didn't take anything except some photographs and a few personal items Grace hadn't sold yet. Everything else was tainted. Betty had already arranged a new home, smaller and more secure, a place where they could heal. She'd arranged for therapy too, the best trauma specialist money could buy. She knew healing wouldn't be quick or easy. She knew the scars her daughters carried would last long after the bruises faded. But she also knew they were survivors, that they had each other, and that this time she wouldn't let anyone hurt them ever again. The first few weeks were hard. Eunice had nightmares about being locked in rooms. Esther still wasn't speaking except to Eunice and occasionally to Betty. They both flinched at sudden movements, hoarded food in their room, and woke up multiple times each night to check that Betty was still there. Betty sat with them through the nightmares, reassured them that they were safe, gave them space to be angry and sad without trying to rush their healing. She apologized endlessly for leaving them, for not realizing how bad it would get. Eunice said she understood why Betty had done it. Esther didn't say anything, but she held Betty's hand tighter, and Betty accepted that as the forgiveness she wasn't sure she deserved. Therapy helped. Slowly, painfully, the twins began processing what they'd experienced. They learned to name their feelings, to understand that what happened wasn't their fault. Esther started speaking again, first in whispers during therapy sessions, then in full sentences at home, and finally, almost 6 months later, she laughed at something silly Eunice said, and the sound was so beautiful, Betty cried. Eunice stopped having nightmares as frequently. She learned that protecting Esther didn't mean sacrificing herself, that they could both be vulnerable and still be safe. She learned to be a child again. Betty focused on her own healing too. The cancer was in remission, but she'd learned that physical health meant nothing without mental and emotional health. She went to therapy, addressed the codependency and people-pleasing patterns that had allowed her family to exploit her for decades. She learned to set boundaries, to accept that loving someone doesn't obligate you to fund their dysfunction. She learned that generosity without boundaries isn't generosity at all. It's enabling. The legal proceedings took over a year. Thomas was convicted of embezzlement and fraud. He lost the company, lost his reputation, and served 18 months in prison. His wife divorced him and took everything he had left. Grace faced multiple civil lawsuits from people she'd defrauded over the years. She lost her house, her lifestyle, her social standing. Last Betty heard, Grace was working retail and living in a one-bedroom apartment, finally experiencing the financial struggles she'd always pretended to have. Mark's gambling debts caught up with him without Betty's money to bail him out. He declared bankruptcy, lost everything. The extended family fared no better. The family name, once associated with Betty's success, became associated with betrayal and child abuse. People crossed the street to avoid them. Former friends stopped returning calls. They became pariahs in the community they'd once dominated. 3 years after the fake death, Eunice and Esther were 14. They were thriving in their new school, had made genuine friends, were excelling academically. Eunice wanted to be a lawyer, said she wanted to protect people the way their mother had protected them. Esther was artistic, painting and drawing constantly, using art to process trauma in ways words still sometimes couldn't reach. They were still closer than most siblings, still protective of each other, but they'd learned they could trust other people too. They were healing, not healed because trauma doesn't work that way, but healing, and that was enough. Betty rebuilt her company slowly, carefully, with people she trusted and values she'd learned the hard way. She was more selective about her generosity now, gave to organizations and causes rather than individuals, required accountability before committing resources. She learned to say no without guilt, to set boundaries without apology, to recognize that self-preservation isn't selfishness. She had her daughters, her work, her health, and her peace. That was more than enough. Sometimes late at night, Betty wondered if she'd done the right thing, if there was some other way she could have handled it. But then she remembered watching Esther being locked in her room for breaking a glass. She remembered hearing her family casually discuss eliminating 2 children. She remembered Eunice's too thin body and Esther's lost voice. And she knew that yes, she'd done the right thing, because the alternative would have meant sacrificing her daughters on the altar of family loyalty. And her daughters deserved better. They deserved someone willing to burn down the whole world to keep them safe. The moral of Betty's story isn't complicated. It's about the difference between being nice and being good. Nice is giving people what they ask for even when it hurts you. Good is protecting the vulnerable even when it's hard. Nice is keeping peace at any cost. Good is accepting that sometimes peace isn't possible, that sometimes the only way to stop enabling harm is to cause discomfort. Betty had spent her whole life being nice. It nearly killed her and destroyed her daughters. She survived by learning to be good instead. And good meant accountability. Good meant boundaries. Good meant accepting that love requires more than just giving. It requires wisdom about who deserves your gifts and courage to withhold them from people who will use them to hurt you. If you had been in Betty's position, what would you have done? Would you have faked your death to uncover the truth? Or would you have trusted your family without such extreme measures? Would you have been able to watch your children suffer for months to gather evidence? Or would you have intervened immediately? How do you balance the need for proof with the cost of obtaining it? Comment below and tell me what you would have done. This story is about the price of silence and the cost of speaking up. It's about how trauma hides in plain sight and how we're often complicit in our own exploitation. It's about children who shouldn't have to survive their own families, and women who learn too late that strength without boundaries is just another word for being taken advantage of. It's about the moment you realize that the people you die for wouldn't lift a finger to save you, and what you do with that devastating knowledge. What would you do if you were Betty? Would you have the strength to disappear and watch, or would you intervene immediately? How do you protect the ones you love when the threat comes from inside your own family? Drop your answer in the comments. And please subscribe to this channel. These stories matter. They're not just entertainment. They're warnings and lessons and reminders that we all need. They're proof that sometimes the hardest battles we fight are against the people who are supposed to be on our side. So, subscribe. Share this story, let it reach people who need to hear it, and remember that family is what you make it, not what you're born into. Blood doesn't make you family. Love does. Protection does. Showing up does. Everything else is just biology and obligation.